Well, welcome to my first process stream that I'm doing for my Capstone project. So I'll just kind of walk through a little bit of what this project is, and then each week I'm going to go and talk about what I've worked on that week and where I am in the project. And so to kind of begin, I wanted to show this little animation or slide to kind of describe what this project is. And the goal of this project kind of came about after a couple of years of developing in Unity and Unreal and wanting to use it as a design tool, but really coming upon a lot of friction in being able to use it as a design tool because of the barrier to entry with coding and the time it took. And I found myself spending more time trying to develop code for how the system would work than actually developing out the designs that I wanted to. So, and after talking to a lot of different people, wanting to get into VR, wanting to get into AR, or wanting just to use the tools in their process, even for storytelling, there's a huge stopgap there within development. So this project kind of came from that need that I was seeing throughout the couple of years in this industry. And what I'm trying to do is essentially create a system that allows for easy prototyping of interactions and animations within the software of Gravity Sketch, within their system specifically. And a lot of the system that I am developing kind of came from inspiration from Figma and from Adobe XD and their frame-based approach of animating, right? You basically take a frame, you copy it, and then you change some aspects of the frame, and then when you click interact, it will animate or move to that other state. And it's very easy to understand. It's a little bit easier to understand even than keyframing. And it offers just enough limitation to be able to do a lot of creative things, but without being too complex. So I wanted to take that sort of ideology and apply it within 3D and apply it for the VR space to give interaction, to give the ability to prototype. And so this software is nowhere near, this system is not meant to be like the finalized thing that you show, but rather a tool for sketching out interactions and sketching out motion of a product or service or anything really that you can sketch in the Gravity Sketch environment. And I like to think of it almost as this kind of like sketching out storyboards in real time and being able to iterate on that sort of user experience. So I'm just going to kind of first walk through my overall like flow for what this would look like and kind of describe some of the components that are present in this system so far. And then I'll show some working prototypes that I have, some really early prototypes and kind of my thought process and development in those. So first, I'll just kind of show you this Gravity Sketch environment. And that's sort of the fun thing, is to be able to sketch in Gravity Sketch for things that would be developed for Gravity Sketch. That's been an interesting and fun experience. But before I get into the whole flow of how this works, I just kind of wanted to break down the components of this. And I'll zoom in on one of these experiences. So the basic idea of this system is essentially to have this kind of menu system. And then also, so I'll show you sort of break this down into its core components here. So there we go. Okay. So we have these objects, and then we have this menu, right? And so the basic idea of this whole system, and I kind of showed it a little bit in the animation before, but you have these frames, like so. You have these frames, and then you have your like working geometry, right? And so essentially what you can do is like select a frame and then edit the position, and then select the other frame, edit the position, and then click play, and then it'll animate between these two things, like moving these objects and however you set that up, right? So that's the animation quality of this. And then the other aspect is to be able to set one object as a trigger. So in one of these sketches, I kind of illustrate this idea. Here's where I kind of illustrate that, right? Where I set an object as a trigger, and then when I click play, if I interact with that object, then it'll move to the next frame and animate how I want it. And I'll show you in the working prototype how that works a little bit more clearly. But that's sort of the core, right? You have the triggers and you have the animations. The ability to interact with objects, and then that interaction driving an animation. So with that, I've been trying to figure out how do I incorporate this system into the Gravity Sketch kind of UX language. And one of the core, like, fundamental properties of Gravity Sketch is kind of the keep it as simple as possible mentality, and also have everything relate to this idea, this feeling, this experience of sketching, right? Like being able to have sort of this, my intent matches what my what I'm trying to think, right? My idea matches what's actually coming out through my hands. And everything kind of being developed in a way that allows for speed and proficiency upon increased amount of use over time. So like the more I use this, the faster I can be at it. I don't have to click through a bunch of menus or anything to try to do something. It's all very intuitive. It's all very fluid. So that way I can keep that state of flow as I'm creating and making in this space. So I wanted to carry on and really like stay true to what that vision and that drive for what Gravity Sketch is. And so to do that, it's taken a lot of refinement, and I'm still in the process of kind of refining down details until it's at the core of that process. And so to kind of understand the overall process of what this would look like within Gravity Sketch, I laid it out in this 3D kind of flow chart, right? The first step in this flow chart is kind of the traditional Gravity Sketch approach, right? We have creating a model with all the tools and properties they give you, right? Sketching and doing sub-D modeling and whatever, right? You create the model, you create the sketch, right? The next step, and I broke this into two different areas, but it's all kind of the same thing, right? You're creating and editing the frame collection. And the frame collection refers to kind of this menu, and that's the collection of different like frames or states of the objects that you're trying to interact or animate, right? Sort of the keyframes, if you will. So this is the process of creating one of those from geometry that you just made previously. And then you have actually creating new frames within that frame collection and connecting them and making connections between them to kind of show how the process or the animation flows. And then you have fine tuning. And so this could be adding frame transitions. So what happens between the frames? How does it animate? How fast does it animate? Is it a trigger? Is it not a trigger? Adding object behaviors, like the ability to grab an object while things are playing, or to hide or unhide an object, or set it as a trigger. And then you have all these sets where you can actually edit things, right? How do you go back and edit each one of these properties, and what happens when you do that? And then finally, like, you need the ability to test it, right? So from that, we need to test what the frame collection is and what does that look like. And then finally exiting. Absolute last thing is then exiting back into the normal environment. So that's sort of what the core of this, and I made it I intentionally made it really generalized, so that way I could sketch on a bunch of different ideas within these. So where I'm at with this currently is I'm just trying to understand like what systems are pre-existing in Gravity Sketch that I can kind of build from. So a new system that they just added was this idea of subgroups, and being able to have like basically hierarchies of groupable objects. So one idea was, okay, maybe you take a grouped object, you group edit it, and then you can convert it into a frame collection, right? Another idea was you put all the objects onto a layer and then you convert that layer into an object. And then this idea is, okay, maybe there's a whole new menu on the main tool set here that you could basically create frame collections and kind of manage them here. And maybe that's where you play them. And then lastly, I was like taking from some of the reference of like, the tool belt here, or even convert this really quick into a sub-D model, right? Even taking some pointers from sort of their tool selection system here. And this was before they had released that update, and I was kind of referencing some of their older stuff. But I was like, okay, maybe it's a tool belt. Maybe it's a whole toolbar that you like swipe up, and that's how you get it. And then you can like select objects. So these are some of the different entry points into it. And then looking at like, okay, let's say you had some pieces of geometry that you wanted to add into this frame collection. So maybe you drag and you drop it into this frame collection, similarly to how you do layers, right? So you like grab an object and like put it into that layer, right? Maybe it functions similarly to that. One of the questions I have actually that I need to work out is like, how do you actually take geometry out of that? It's simple. It's kind of simplistic to think, okay, I can place it in, simple enough. How do you get it out? And that's a challenge that I need to kind of work through. I continually need to work through that one out. And then how do you edit frame collection? And this one is actually kind of challenging, and that's because of the fact of like, so let's say I had like, this was my frame collection. Right? I had my frame collection is sitting here, and I want to go to edit it. Okay, they have the Gravity Sketch edit feature, so I can go through and I can edit this, and bam, I'm in the editable environment. Pretend that this is like the frame collection menu and stuff. But now I wanted to go through and edit geometry inside here. Like I wanted to edit this. Now I've got to grab and I'm doing another edit. So this concept of nested edits is necessary if that's how I approach setting up frame collections, right? Where essentially if I use the convert way or I do the tool select menu way, right? I'm gonna have to have some sort of like a nested edit, editing within editing. And that's something that I think could be possible, but it may end up causing a lot of friction in people being a little confused over like, okay, I'm in here, I'm editing, I edit this, I'm like, I want to exit out of it, I'm still in another edit, like what do I do? And I have some different like ways of maybe visually signifying that. So like, I had this idea of like, okay, maybe you have like 2 arrows on top of each other, and the top arrow would represent the editing that you're in currently, and as you click through that, then it's 1 more arrow, and then so you can kind of like represent how many layers you are in terms of editing, which in this case would only be 2. Like you'd edit the frame collection, then you'd edit another thing, then you edit the objects within it. But it does pose a question. Is that too challenging? Is that too confusing? So that's where it kind of led me to this idea where, okay, maybe instead of like grabbing and editing an object, you just select it similarly to how you select a layer, right? Maybe you just select that, and that's what drives, which one you're editing currently. The only difference is I would have to, like in the layers, like you're always working on a layer, but you may not always be working on a frame collection. So you'd have to have the ability to basically select out, right? Layers right now don't have that ability. And that's one reason why I did a visually different way. Like I wanted to represent this in a different way than the layer system, because I wanted there to be a distinction between how these things function. If this does function a little bit, like it's essentially the same as a layer system, but because it functions a little bit differently, I wanted to break it from that norm, so that way people didn't mistake them as the same sort of thing. So that's sort of the thought process there, and honestly, the editing part is another one of those challenges that I think needs to be addressed and need to work through, maybe get some feedback on. And then actually creating frames. Originally, I had a tool, the framer tool, where you'd like select the objects and you create a new frame. But honestly, the copying system in Gravity Sketch is already great. And so essentially all I need to do is like when you create a frame collection, it starts off with, it gives you 1 frame. Whatever the objects are in the initial frame, that's what it gives you, right? And then if you want more, you could just copy it, And that's kind of similar to how you do it in Adobe XD, right? Like you can create, in Adobe XD, you can like create a new frame from scratch. But typically you're copying and moving because it's simpler to do that. And you already have things in a specific way, and you don't want to like completely change that. You want to just build off of that and animate from it. So the idea is to essentially, like if I had one, all I'd have to do is grab it, copy it, and now I have another one, and then I'd have to connect them. But and so it's a really simple approach to creating things, and it helps me not have to have another tool involved. The next thing is, how do you actually connect frames, right? So I kind of iterated on some different ideas with this. I was like, okay, maybe you have a specified button that you click and you connect. Great. Maybe there's an icon, a connection icon that is present on each frame that you, when you hover over that and you select it, you can then, connect to the next frame. Maybe it's a press and hold situation where you hover over it, you press and hold the trigger, and then you select another object. But the challenge that was present in this iteration or this part of the process is I need to be able to not only select this icon, but I need to also select this. So the process that I was envisioning for editing a frame was, instead of having to like grab a frame and edit, which could be how you do it, but to reduce the amount of menus and things, you don't really need to do that every single time you want to edit something, and that's an extra click. So I wanted to be able to just tap this, and then that edits the object. So that poses a problem of how do you then, if you're tapping this, how do you then also like tap and then click over here? So if I wanted to tap and select that, how do you differentiate those two things? And maybe even, there's a bunch of different ways, and one of the ways I actually, in just talking this out, thought about was triggering it. You could literally just, if you wanted to edit it, you'd tap it. If you wanted to connect something, you'd press the trigger and connect. Maybe that's a good way of doing it, but that's an aside. The one method that I was thinking that might be kind of interesting is doing an icon, and this actually helps me out later on. And when you set up triggers, that this icon could change to a trigger icon, and then you could set up different things. So I'm leaning towards this, but even in just talking this out loud, like maybe a system with differing select and trigger select would be maybe easier. In adding frame transitions, so I have kind of progressed a little bit in how I've been thinking about this. So originally I was thinking, okay, you have these little icons, you drag and you drop them and you place them in between the positions, and then you could grab it, click it, and edit it, similar to this system. But then you have to have all these icons here, and it's another thing, it's another tool. And so what I started to think about was, okay, similarly how you grab and edit everything else, maybe you can grab and edit that connection point. And you could just, once you edited it, it would open up this little menu. You could add different transitions. And so maybe there's other transitions that are developed in the future, and so you could add them here. So that was one way of thinking about it. And then similarly, you could like grab that transition and you could click to edit it. In this case, it's kind of showing the delay, right? You could 3-second delay, and you could play around with how long that animation takes to move to the next one. In terms of the triggering, this is kind of looking at that. So like triggering is more of like a behavior I'm adding to an object. And so when I add that behavior, right now, if I click that, it will trigger to move to the next slide or the next frame. So this idea is like, okay, like let's pretend that there was no connection here, right? There's nothing connecting those. And so when I click an object to place in there, the menu knows, okay, I've now clicked an object in this frame. It populates a little UI symbol. Instead of that like orange UI, pops up a little trigger icon. And then now I can drag and select the next one. So when I click this, it triggers that next move. And the other thing that I could do is, when I'm hovering over that icon, I could show which object is that trigger, because there may be more than one trigger. Maybe each one of these triggers a different frame that I can go to. So I need to be able to specify which object I'm actually selecting. So that's kind of what that shows. But in the other consideration too is, okay, if I'm adding behaviors to objects, are those behaviors being added to that object? And how is that being represented? So in this case, I'm like, okay, if I add the behavior of triggering, if I want to edit that behavior, maybe it's a separate piece of geometry in space that's like a UI piece of geometry that I could grab and I could edit and change aspects about it. And in this case, like one of the things that I need to have with this triggering is this idea of like, okay, what would count as a trigger? Like what would trigger this object? And so maybe you have like when you edit, you could like have this paintbrush and you could select different objects in the scene that would trigger this. If overlapped, it would trigger that event. So, or the other thought is like, maybe I could even like select a controller, and then my controller would be the thing that triggers it. Or I could select my head, and that would, like, if I pass my head through it, then that would trigger it. So that was sort of the idea behind having a menu system there. And so I kind of broke these into this like object oriented, or like this object methodology of representing this behavior. So that's what this is. And then the other one is kind of this panel approach, right? So it's same thing, but instead of having a selectable trigger object that represents that behavior, like the behavior is added on to the edit panel of this object, and you kind of like start racking them up at the top here, which I thought was kind of an interesting idea, but it's adds, then it kind of breaks that quality of Gravity Sketch where you don't have all these menus and things that you have to select. Now you have like this growing tree of menus. So there's an issue there. And that's sort of why I'm leaning more towards like an object-based approach rather than more panels to reduce the amount of menus that you have to interact with. And yeah, this is just demonstrating some more editing of this, and this is like showing what I was talking about with like clicking a frame and being able to edit that one now. And so yeah, that's where I'm at so far in kind of sketching. And I still need to develop a little bit more out and think through this a little bit. But I'll go ahead and show what I've been working on for the prototypes. I decided to take a little bit of a break from doing Gravity Sketch iterations and work on building like a really quick prototype or a series of prototypes. So I kind of had a breakthrough in thinking. I was like, originally I was trying to bog myself down and like, oh, I've got to build every aspect of Gravity Sketch, and then before I can start prototyping. And my first realization was like, no, all I have to do is just build kind of like a proof of concept in a 2D format, not even incorporating VR into it. So this is what this first prototype did, right? And I'll show you. So essentially, which I'm not sure why my UI went away, but the idea is like you can just move these objects, and these different buttons represent different frames, and then you can click play. Let me try to set this up again. I'm not sure why this. Somehow every time I try to show stuff, something breaks. Let's see. You can. Interesting. I don't remember what I did here. Well, the basic idea is like you have these two buttons that interact on the screen, and then you can click one and move the objects, and then click the other and then move them again. Let me see if I can just maybe trigger this. Oh, I remember now. It's because I have VR set up. Oops. So let me go turn that off. It screws up the, here we go. I'll turn that off for now. I'll need to turn that back on later, but okay. So now I'll go ahead and show it. So what we can do is, so the first frame is selected. It's represented by this little guy. And so right now I'm editing this frame. So I'll just like move these over here. I can rotate them. I can scale them. And then I'll click to edit the second one. And maybe what I'll do is take all these objects and make them tiny. And so now frame one is this, frame two is this. And when I click play, it animates between these. So this is just kind of showing the basics of the system. So next, which I need to put VR back on, turn that back on. Prototype 2 was, okay, I was able to get this to work in 2D. Let's get this to work in 3D with VR. And I'm using the VR interaction framework to kind of take care of all the VR stuff within it. So that way I don't have to build a whole interaction system myself. And so I'll showcase this. Let's make this window a little bit bigger. There we go. Put the headset on. Show how this works. So I tried to add in the behavior of like grabbing objects similar to how Gravity Sketch does, but I haven't added the ability to scale this, so it's just a fixed size. But so same thing, right? We have hover, we have frame 1, frame 2, and we have the play button. And that's actually showing right now that it works. But so we'll have frame 1. I can move these. Right now you can't scale them. You can just rotate them. And then when you click on frame 2, you get, which I added because I think this would be necessary in understanding what's happening between the frames. I added this kind of like just reference UI that shows you what the previous frame looked like. So now I can kind of move these around. And then when I click play, it animates between them. And this system right now isn't perfect. There's a lot of little details and things that I want to add back, that I want to add to it. For instance, it stays in the last frame, but I want it to move back to the first frame. So I've got to add that in. But that just shows like the basic functionality of, you know, being able to set this up, maybe change this up a little bit again, and then animate the objects. So that was the second round, which was just about kind of showing animation. And then this last prototype that I've developed today was less about, or was adding in the functionality of being able to add triggers to objects and kind of playing with that idea. So let's say we keep this first frame there, and then the second frame, maybe we want these to move over here. And then I'll go back to the first frame, and I added this little stick. This will change, but I added this little stick where I could then tap this, and it turns into a trigger. And so now when I click play, right, you notice nothing's happening, but then if I tap it, then it moves to the next frame and it animates, and then I can do it again. Bam. So this is just showcasing like the core functionality, and I already can think of a ton of different uses just for these two features alone. But yeah, just being able to kind of play with it, and even just having these two frames, it's really fun because now I can change these really easily. Maybe on the second frame, the trigger itself moves. So we go back here and we click play. Now the whole thing moves. But yeah, this is the prototype that I'm working with so far. And I've got to go back and kind of do some more thought, or think a little bit more about the user flow and the integration into Gravity Sketch and do some sketching there. But it was a helpful break to kind of just get something that I could visualize out, and kind of helping explain this idea. But yeah, that's all that I have for today, and I'm looking forward to showing kind of where I am next week. But thank you for watching, and yeah, we'll see where it goes.